Hi there, and thanks for listening to the Explaining History YouTube channel, watching even. I'm just going to talk a little bit today about Henry VIII and the divorce crisis and Catherine of Aragon, and also the break with Rome. Henry VIII had married Catherine of Aragon in 1509. She had meant to marry his older brother Arthur, but Arthur died before he could take the throne. And Catherine of Aragon had been stranded in England, unable to return to Spain. Henry VII had kept her really a virtual prisoner and had been seen as being quite cruel. The English people were quite sympathetic towards her and viewed her as being a rather tragic figure, unable, obviously, to have a child because she was unmarried. Henry marries her for a number of reasons, probably. Firstly, because it is seen as a popular thing to do. Secondly, he may well have quite liked her. She's considerably older than he is. And also because it was seen as the fulfilment of a promise to her. It was Henry's perhaps impulsive side coming out. Henry VIII, by 1522, is bored and fed up. The royal physicians in that year announced that Catherine will have no further children. They've had one daughter, Mary, in 1516, and there were various other babies who were either miscarried or died in infancy, but no male heir, crucially. Henry is approaching his middle years. He's getting a bit older, and he's bored with Catherine, who is now 37 years old. Henry looks to Catherine, and he's not half as interested in her as he is in an attractive new lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. But I don't think that the presence of Anne Boleyn really explains the divorce. It simply provides Henry with an opportunity to find a new potential queen. The divorce really is about succession, about Henry's concern for the dynasty, and also it is about two other figures, Thomas Wolsey and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Thomas Wolsey was a cardinal. This meant that he was one of the 12 bishops of Rome who were immediately junior to the Pope. Thomas Wolsey had been born into relative obscurity. He was the son of an Ipswich butcher. He gained royal service under Henry VII, and acted as a kind of an intermediary, and he was under Henry VIII originally the figure in the royal household who administered the king's charities, essentially, who gave scraps to the paupers outside the back of the palace. This job was what we would call a sinecure. It was a job that one actually paid money to do, and the reason why you would pay money to do it is because it helps you to get closer to the king, and once you get close enough to the king and you can prove your worth, then all the expense pays off in a big way. Thomas Wolsey was the right man in the right place at the right time in 1509. Henry VIII was fed up with his father's advisors. His father's advisors had told him to do essentially what his father had done, to keep an even keel, to not spend too much money, not have any wars, and to make sure that there's more money coming into the treasury than going out. This is not what Henry really wants to do. Henry likes spending money. He enjoys royal progresses up and down the land, which cost money. He thinks that war is the sport of kings, and war is something that kings should definitely be involved in. He believes that the people must see a noble and regal and majestic king. This involves large expenditure on royal palaces, artwork, and obviously the finery that the king wears and the king's retinue. So he has a real spending habit, but his most expensive vice is war. Shortly after 1509, Henry declares that he sees his rightful claim to the throne of France, as all English kings since Henry V have done, and is determined to wage war in France, which is an expensive and rather unsuccessful affair. Thomas Wolsey comes along into the middle of all of this when Henry's advisors are being dismissed left, right, and centre, and the old retinue of Henry VII's advisors are either dismissed and some of them imprisoned, and two of them even executed. And he proves himself to be a Mr. Fix-It. He is the person within the Henry's household who can solve Henry VIII's problems. He can help raise the money for wars, and he can organise and administer logistically the supplies, troops, and equipment to get them to where they need to be. And he's also very useful when it comes to arranging diplomatic events such as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Anyway, by the 1520s, the Mr. Fix-It Wolsey is no longer able to work his magic. Henry VIII had taken Wolsey, who was a commoner, and given him, instead of noble appointments, ecclesiastical appointments, church appointments. So he'd made him eventually the Archbishop of York, and that's the highest appointment that Henry within England was able to give him. The one appointment higher than that would have been the Archbishop of Canterbury, but the current Archbishop Wareham, who hated Wolsey, refused to die, and it was Wareham's great delight that he lived 1 year longer than Wolsey. The appointment beyond Archbishop of Canterbury would be a cardinal. Now Henry can't grant that because that's the Pope's job to grant, so Henry petitions the Pope to get Wolsey to be a cardinal, because he knows that not only will this be a very powerful position for his Lord Chancellor, which is the job that Wolsey finally takes on, but also it means that he will have a great deal of influence over diplomacy. The Pope is the central figure of diplomacy in Europe. If you want to authorise anything fairly major, from a war to a royal divorce, all things Henry's interested in, you need the Pope to okay it. The problem that Wolsey has by the mid-1520s is the Pope is not okaying it. The Pope is not okaying it because the nephew of Catherine of Aragon is Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Holy Roman Emperor and his armies guarantee the safety of Rome, and they can also make sure that Rome is not safe. They can actually take action against Rome if necessary. However, this means that Wolsey cannot do the king's bidding. Wolsey relies completely for his power on his ability to do the king's bidding, and if Wolsey can't offer service, then Henry will no longer offer friendship. It's a two-way deal. And by the late 1520s, about 1527, it's clear that this divorce is not coming off. The Pope himself, Pope Clement, knew that he could either enrage Henry or Charles V, and so he tried to play for time. He tried to kind of drag the issue out as long as possible, hoping that Henry would get bored with Anne Boleyn and just reconcile himself to marriage. Obviously, he didn't know Henry very well. When Wolsey first approached the Pope, he said, "Look, there's a bit in the Old Testament, in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, that says one shall not marry one's brother's widow. So you should never have agreed to allow, or the papacy should never have agreed to allow Henry to marry Catherine in any way. So that says the marriage is pretty much invalid. So let's just annul it and let Henry move on. And Wolsey, when he gets more and more desperate, he says, well, why don't you let me organise things? And we'll do the whole annulment in England, where I, as the papal representative, Wolsey had a special title, legatus alitere, which means he was the Pope's ambassador. I, as the Pope's ambassador in England, I'd be able to supervise it, and I could make sure it came to the right outcome. But there can't be a right outcome because the Pope doesn't want to anger Charles V. And so the Pope says, okay, well, I'll allow 2 papal ambassadors, 2 papal legates to work out what's going to happen. Yourself, Wolsey, and Cardinal Campeggio. Now, Wolsey thinks, great, okay, I'm going to get my decision at last. But Campeggio takes a long time to get to England, and when he does, he drags things out and delays proceedings on purpose, meaning that they have to be suspended in 1529. Now, Wolsey has basically been very unpleasant to the nobles. He's spent years and years bullying and threatening the nobles and taking land off them, and be acting like a tyrant towards them. So the moment that they find out that Wolsey's in big trouble, that Wolsey is, that his golden luck has run out with the king, the nobles begin to talk to the king, and Wolsey's done a good job of keeping them away from the king, and they sort of say all sorts of things about him, suggesting that he's even a traitor. That the reason why he won't grant the king a divorce is because he's loyal to the Pope, not the king. Henry, prone to wild sort of mood swings, has Wolsey impeached, which means that has him attainted, which means that Wolsey is it's possible to put Wolsey on trial, and the king withdraws his royal favour from Wolsey. So that means that Wolsey can't appeal to the king to save himself. Wolsey was recalled to London. He'd been exiled in York. He was recalled to London, but on the way in 1530 he dies. He dies of natural causes. The next couple of years are referred to by historians as the years of drift. That Henry still hasn't got his divorce, doesn't know quite what to do. And it takes Wolsey's understudy, Thomas Cromwell, to come up with a suggestion. Thomas Cromwell was a very well-educated man and also a commoner. Thomas Cromwell had been all over Europe as a young man and read widely, and 2 of the things he'd read were the works of Martin Luther, and he'd read the works of Niccolo Machiavelli. And in both those works, it suggests that the king should be sovereign within his realm, that there should be no other rival power. So there should be no pope, for example, and that the king should control not just all the subjects in his realm, but also the church too. And Cromwell says to Henry, well, this is a good idea. This would get you what you wanted. This would get you your divorce. And it would also mean that we would control the wealth of the church as well. And you've got a lot of financial problems, sire. Henry is initially very nervous. The idea of breaking away from Rome and declaring himself head of the Church of England is a serious undertaking. It's a blasphemous thing to do, and it could conceivably, for a devout person, wind you up in hell for eternity. But also, it appeals to Henry's ego. And the attack on the Roman Catholic Church begins. The Parliament, that had been called, under a special title, the Reformation Parliament, began denouncing the church, calling it essentially corrupt and saying it was abusing its position, and recognising Henry as the only sovereign lord and protector and defender of the church. And this is obviously meets with stiff resistance from the church, from the clergy, but they essentially realised that the threat of perhaps force from the crown, of perhaps imprisonment or worse, encourages them to keep quiet. Henry, in the meantime, had been having an affair with Anne Boleyn, and by January 1533 she is pregnant, and so Henry has to marry her very quickly. The question as to whether he was married to two women at the same time is a confused one. It's unclear exactly when the date of the marriage took place. But certainly it looks like it was in January 1533, before the king was able to divorce Catherine of Aragon. But then again, the king always said that the marriage to Catherine of Aragon was unlawful anyway. And the new Archbishop, Cranmer, in May 1533, declares the marriage illegal, and also 5 days later declares the marriage to Anne to be lawful, where she is crowned queen. So once Henry VIII has authority over the church, he can really make the rules that he likes. The thing that gives Henry not automatic authority over the church, but prevents the church from taking authority over what Henry is doing, is an act passed in April 1533 called the Act in Restraint of Appeals, that meant that any decision passed by the Pope in Rome would have no bearing on what the king could and could not do. And so it essentially puts a kind of like a barrier around English law from Rome. And then in 1534, a new parliament is called, controlled by Cromwell, and this then passes the royal supremacy. The royal supremacy is the formal acceptance by the clergy that the king is the head of the church, and the law that it manifests itself as is the Act of Succession and the Dispensations Act, and also the Act of the Submission of the Clergy are the three laws that meant that the Act of Succession meant that every king thereafter, or queen, would be head of the Church of England. And the other legislation ensured that the clergy would recognise this on pain of legal threat. So by 1534, Henry's desire for a divorce, along with Thomas Cromwell's belief that the king should be sovereign, should be the sole ruler throughout the land, had resulted in a permanent severing of relations between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. But you have to remember that people still worshipped as Catholics in England. They still did largely the same things in church. This is not the beginnings of Protestantism. That happens under Henry's son, Edward VI.